Hi everybody, I'm Terry Ryder, founder of hotspotting.com.au. Welcome to today's special event. And today we're discussing a topic that I think more and more investors are going to be interested in as property markets change, especially in the bigger cities. And our topic is, don't wait for the market, create your own capital growth. And this addresses the potential for investors to undertake small developments. Increasingly, I find property investors are not content with the old paradigm of what's known as passive investment, where you buy an existing property, install a tenant, and wait for it to grow in value. More and more, investors are looking for strategies to accelerate the growth process. And undertaking small-scale developments is potentially one of the most exciting and dynamic ways to do it. I imagine that some real estate consumers at least think that undertaking developments is perhaps too big or too complex for them to contemplate, but I think today's webinar will show us that that's not the case. Our special guest today to tell us about the possibilities is Dutt from one of our partner businesses, Adviseable. And just before I introduce Alex and his presentation, I just want to remind you that those of you out there watching and listening, if you have any questions, please type them into either the chat box or the Q&A box, and those will come up on my screen. And towards the end of the presentation, I'll put your questions to Alex, and so hopefully you'll get plenty of answers to your most pressing questions. So Alex, welcome.
Thank you. Well, thanks to everyone. Thanks very much for giving up your lunch breaks and just to listen to little old me. Today I'll be talking, as Terry mentioned, about creating wealth through small-scale development. A little bit of a background about us. So we are Adviseable, so we're independent buyers agents and property investment advisors based in Sydney. You might have heard my associate Kate Hill talk about some of the areas that we've been buying in, some of the areas to watch in a webinar about a month ago. So be sure to catch that one if you missed that one. We operate under a fee-for-service business model, so we do not sell real estate. So again, we're independent buyers agents and advisors. Within the past 2 years alone, we've purchased over 125 properties with a value of over $50 million. And our main focus during this time has been buying and developing properties in Queensland, South Australia, and New South Wales on behalf of our clients. And we're members of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, REBA, so the Real Estate Buyers Agents Association of Australia, the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales, and most importantly, all of our advisors are qualified property investment advisors and fully licensed agents as well. I've got a few disclaimers to go through. The first disclaimer is the ubiquitous financial advice disclaimer, which means that, please note that this information contained within is general in nature and does not constitute personal financial advice. So to determine whether these strategies and concepts are suitable for your unique circumstances, we urge you to consult with your appointed financial professional. So the second disclaimer that I have is that property development is a huge topic. Okay, so that chap there trying to get his couch into his little hatchback was how I felt trying to get this all the information that I had stored up here that I wanted to pass on into a 1 hour presentation. So it was a big job. So hopefully I've at least, I'm able to give you guys some information, whether you're at whatever experience level you're at in terms of investment or even property development. So I've mixed it up in terms of, I guess, some high level stuff and also some nuts and bolts, practical information and also some examples. So there's quite a bit we're going to go through. The third disclaimer I should say is that I was very mindful of the examples that I provided because we run a very transparent and ethical business at Adviseable, and it was important to us that we showed you examples that were actually readily achievable. We didn't want to paint a picture of examples that were 1 in a million. Obviously we work very hard to find the examples and they are unique. I'm not going to sit here and say that they're easy to find the examples, but at the same time we did want to show examples that were achievable and realistic out there in the marketplace. So they're my 3 disclaimers. In terms of what we're going to cover off today, I'm going to do a bit of an overview of the type of property development that we're going to be discussing. Then I'm going to look at why people get involved, why property investors get involved in property development, so some of the benefits. How? So we're going to look at some real life examples, including the due diligence process that we go through as buyers agents when we're looking at development opportunities. And also some of the traps, obviously some of the pitfalls to look at based on what I've seen over the years. And I've been, just as a bit of background, I've been investing in property since the early 2000s myself and been in the industry for over 10 years. And some of the tips that I've seen along the way. And we'll look at, I guess, also some locations of interest. I'm going to look, it's going to be pretty high level in terms of locations because, as I mentioned earlier, Kate, my associate, covered off on that in quite great detail. That was the nature of her entire presentation. So right now I want to focus more on property development, some of the practical skills that we can apply to the various areas. And then we'll have a Q&A. As Terry mentioned, if you've got any questions, feel free to type them away and send them in through to Terry. My calling card always seems to be running out of time when I do presentations, so I'll definitely try and be disciplined this time around. So when we talk about property development, I guess I just wanted to cover off on exactly what we're talking about because it has many different, I guess, it can be interpreted in different ways. And what I'm talking about is not buying off the plan or house and land packages from a third-party developer. For me, it's about helping investors become the developer in their own right. Okay, so I'm not saying necessarily not the way to go. You can't make money out of buying off the plan or house and land, but that's not what we're talking about today. And we're not talking about investing in developments via shared ownership structures such as syndicate, partnership, trust, or investment fund. Again, I'm not saying these systems or these ways don't work. I'm just saying that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about a development whereby one investor becomes a sole owner, okay, and they're buying something with an upswing potential, so equity potential to manufacture some growth, as Terry mentioned earlier. And we're talking about a development that enables the investor to have total control over the property through development process, and they're reaping 100% of the benefit. So in other words, they're owning the site, they're buying the untapped site, and they're getting all of the benefit. And most importantly, right now with lending where it is, with APRA and the Royal Commission and what banks are doing, it's ever so important that we look at options that are, able to be financed for mere mortals. Okay, so I'm looking at development opportunities that are being able to be funded through standard residential lending. Okay, and you don't have to be an experienced developer to access it. So I'm not talking about opportunities that require commercial lending or to have a track record in terms of being able to obtain finance. So that's very important. So I guess that's, in a nutshell, what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, why property development? Obviously, the most obvious answer or direct answer is to manufacture short-term profit. So you want to create equity. So whether that's profit that you realize in the short term or equity that you create on paper that you're able to use to leverage into other properties or so on. But that's the idea. You're manufacturing some equity. You're not being reliant on the market. And in turn, that means that you've got greater control over the investment performance. And right now, with markets being a little bit all over the place, some are going sideways, this is a way to, I guess, circumvent that and be less reliant on what the market's doing and capitalize on some of the opportunities that are there to the astute buyer. And also manufacture rent. So manufacture yield. I'm not necessarily advocating to buy property as a cash flow tool, but it's obviously cash flow or rent return makes a property more affordable, so that can help with holding. So property development is enables you to create manufacture yield and again can make the property much more affordable to hold. And also buying and building new, there's some financial incentives in there, such as stamp duty savings. So with the development, with any purchase, you pay stamp duty on the initial purchase, so the site purchase or the block of land. You don't pay stamp duty on a construction contract. Okay, so there's a bit of saving there. And also building new, I should say, you've got greater depreciation deductions. And this was very important based on the budget changes as of last year, relating to how depreciation deductions are claimed. So obviously if you're building from scratch yourself, you're getting full depreciation deductions on both sides in terms of fixtures and fittings and the building write-off. compared to established. So there's some benefits there from a financial aspect. And also we've got, I guess, benefits of new property in itself. Tends to be more appealing from a resale and a tenancy point of view. People like newer. Lower maintenance, if you're built right, you've got lower maintenance, and you're also covered by warranty with your various appliances and things like that, and materials. And also you've got builder's structural warranty protection as well. And you're able to customize. So you can basically build exactly what's going to appeal to the local resale and tenant market as well. So to me, that's really, really important. When we're looking as buyers agents at established properties, we're also, one of the most important things that we ascertain in any given area, what do the local renters and buyers want? Probably more likely what the buyers want, because that's resale is what's going to make us money from a capital growth standpoint, from a profit standpoint. But again, if we're building from scratch by development, we can really hone in and really hit the mark with exactly what people want in any given area. And at the end of the day, I guess it's a more challenging and potentially more rewarding option for the evolving investor. So as I mentioned, I've been working with investors for over 10 years, and there are some recurring themes that I've seen along the way. And one of those recurring themes is that at some point, a property investor will get to the point where they want to experiment with property development. So whether that's after their first purchase, whether it's after their 10th purchase, inevitably, my experience is that property investors will want to dip their toe into some kind of development. It's not for everyone. There are risks involved, and it can be quite expensive and quite an involved process. But it can also be a very rewarding process as well. So that's the why. So one of the strategies that I'm going to talk about a couple of different strategies, but one of the strategies that I'm going to talk a lot about in the early stages here is that subdivide and hold. So quite often people think about developing with the intention to sell, and that definitely works, but it makes the process that much harder, okay, because you've got a lot of considerations, which I'll touch on as the presentation we go through it. But this subdividing with the intention of holding really turns the process on its head, and it creates an opportunity for us to really capitalize on many more opportunities. So what I mean by subdivide is we're finding a site that we can essentially turn into multiple sites. So we're basically subdividing a block of land and turning it into multiple independently titled lots. Now, typically with standard residential lending, we're going to be limited to a maximum of 3 separate lots, so splitting one block into 3. Some lenders, it's a maximum of 2. So we're looking at, when we talk about these subdivisions, we're looking at, again, if we're staying under that standard residential lending umbrella, we're looking at a maximum of 3 or perhaps 2, depending on your lender. Now, in terms of holding, what I'm saying there is, we hold beyond the completion of the development. So we're looking at splitting a block, and I'll go through all this in more detail, but splitting a block and basically hanging onto it and renting it out for a while. So whether that's because they're independently titled, we can do it with one of them, we can sell them separately, or we can hold them for a few years before we sell. We can hold them both for the long term. But again, by subdividing and holding, it really turns the whole process on its head and enables us to look at opportunities that, I guess people that were looking to make an instant profit and sell straight away, that are not going to work for them. One of the things that I've learned along the way, and I've seen all of the best cases with making money through small scale development, and it is more difficult. Obviously, it's a scalable thing. The more money you've got to spend on development in terms of access to commercial lending, and the greater scale you can develop, the more readily profit is achieved. The greater the risk, of course, but when we're looking at small scale, it can be quite difficult to make it work. So it might look good in theory and on paper, but it's quite difficult to actually make it profitable with all the considerations. So, but of all the best examples I've seen of this, there's always a combination of one of 3 things. It's either someone's bought the existing site when the market was, in a bull run, or they bought very, very well, and they've seen significant capital growth on the site, whether that's along the way while they've been redeveloping, or they bought some time ago and it's been exposed to considerable capital growth. Or the second and third option, kind of similar, is that they're either owner builders or they work with builders, and they're able to get very good rates in terms of construction. And those three things tend to really make the best case scenario. And that's obviously we do have some control about when we're buying the site, but for most of us, we're not builders. We've got other professions or other interests that we want to do. So I guess it can be difficult to tap into or leverage off being, the benefits of knowing builders or being builders ourselves. So that's why they kind of work around that to soften that. We can look at holding on to it for a little while. And we also alleviate some other considerations, which I'll touch on throughout the presentation, relating to selling straight away. So here's an example in Brisbane. So this is a subdivision example. This is in a suburb in the Sandgate region, which is about 18 kilometres north, next to the coast there in Brisbane. It's under Brisbane City Council. This particular lot, over 800 square metres. So that's what we're looking for in Brisbane City Council. We want to split a block, a subdividable block that we can turn into two 400 plus square metre lots. And the configuration that we're after is we want a 20 metre frontage and a 40 metre deep block. And we're going to turn that into two lots, 10 metres wide and 40 metres deep. So 400 square metres. So this block, you can see it's double fronted. The house is nothing flash, but that's the whole point. We're looking at the raw land, and in effect, the house was nothing flash because we wanted to get rid of it. So that's the demolition process. And ultimately, what we did with that lot was turn it into two owner-occupier homes. So we're going to rent these out. We are holding them and renting them out, but they're appealing to the local resale market, so that's most important. So the rule of thumb with any development, small-scale development, is we want to maximise the land that we've got by squeezing the biggest dwelling we can get away with on the site. Okay, and that's in this case the biggest dwelling or the biggest structure that the market would bear is two 5-bed, 3-bath, 4-living, double lock-up garage homes. Okay, so big homes, much bigger than my home, but that's what the local market bear there, and that's, I guess, the maximum use of the site. So you can see on the floor plans, they are big homes, around 265 square metres. So two high set, 2 stories, and you can see the living areas there. So that was the best use of that particular site. So we've turned a little old weatherboard house sitting right in the middle of a big block into two big homes there. So as an example of one that I purchased recently, I thought I'd go through the numbers. And this particular one was in Wavell Heights, which is about 11 kilometres north of Brisbane CBD. So it's a really great spot. Gone through some significant changes over the last 5 years. It's very much quite an active market in Brisbane terms compared to, a lot of investors that I talk to that are buying on the fringes of Brisbane. They can attest that the markets aren't always that active out there, but in the inner rings or middle rings, some of these owner-occupier markets are very, very strong. And this is definitely falls into that category. So again, we've got a big block there. So big block, 814 square metres, had a pretty average house when our builder went and inspected the house for some preliminary due diligence. I can't repeat how he described the house because of harsh language, but he didn't paint a pretty picture, put it that way. But again, we're looking at it as a raw site and what the block of land can offer. So the house itself is immaterial. It is important that we do our due diligence on the house in relation to demolition, which I'll touch on in a bit. But basically, when we're doing our preliminary assessment, we're looking at what is this block of land worth, what can we do with it, and so on. So again, weatherboard tiled roof home, pretty modest, 1950s build, falls under Brisbane City Council. Last sold about 10 months after I was born, so for 18,900. So it's definitely a testament to how rare these sites come up in Wavell Heights. Again, going back to my disclaimer about being a unicorn, they do exist. I'm not going to say this one was easy to find. It was purchased off market, so it was a lot of work to find it and get access to it and be able to buy it. So I never saw the light of day on realestate.com or anything like that. But they are out there. There's a handful of them left, splitter blocks, and they're not on the market, but they're definitely out there in these suburbs. But again, great spot in terms of being able to develop and build a big home to appeal to the owner-occupier market. So we paid $810 for this, and we looked at it purely as, okay, what's each block worth? In Wavell Heights, if we can get 400 plus square metre blocks, what are they worth? Okay, so I'll take you through the numbers on this particular one. So purchase price for $810, as I mentioned. Purchase costs, so our stamp duty and our legal fees are around $34,000. Our subdivision costs, and I'll do a breakdown in my next example, what all those subdivision costs are, but council contributions, all those bits and pieces that we're going to need to pay, worked out to be, to split the block, $88,000. And construction for two very big homes, $330,000. Okay, so again, we're going to follow that model of a 5-bed, 4 living, 3 bathroom, double lock-up garage home. For this one, we won't be putting in in-ground pools, but just as a side note, what we'll do with this one is we'll put a gate between the 2 fences between the properties. So when we come to sell, we'll be able to access through the backyards, so trades can get in there and put in in-ground pools if we choose to be more appealing to the local resale market. So that's the demographic that we're really going for. So we want to make sure we can tenant these properties, and they'll definitely rent. But the end goal is to build something that's going to appeal to the local owner-occupier market, and that includes putting in a pool. We don't want to worry about pools while we're renting them out for the next whatever long it takes, whether it's 5 or 10 years. But we make kind of allowances along the way to maximise resale potential. So the project cost all up is going to be around $1.55 million, and the end value, which I've conservatively put in at $885 per side, and I'll talk you through how I come up with that valuation shortly. So that's quite conservative. So I've got a gross profit in there of $211,000, so on paper, which is around 14%. Okay, so again, this is why once we start looking at developing to sell, we're going to be looking at other costs eating into that, selling agents costs, capital gains tax, GST and things like that, which I'll explain later. But that'll lead into that. But on paper, we're creating some genuine equity in there. So the other way to look at it as well is, outside of just creating equity on the end result in terms of what we're putting in, the 155 against the 177, the other way to look at it is what we're actually putting in up front. So if we're borrowing 80% against our site purchase price of 810 and our construction cost of 660, so in other words, we're getting loans against those 2 things we can borrow. We're using existing equity or cash to pay for our purchase cost, our subdivision costs, our 20% deposits on the purchase price of the site, and 20% for the construction, and then other contingency along the way, such as loan interest repayments and things like that throughout the process. If we look at that lump sum money, so we're putting in $416,000 as our deposit, we're actually getting a 51% return on investment within 12 months. So this project, based on, knock on wood, with the DA, we'll be able to get that done pre-settlement, and we'll get to site pretty quickly. So we should have this all turned around, again, knock on wood, within 12 months. So the return on investment, if you look at it that way, it's about 51% on the capital up front. Not including selling, of course, as I mentioned, but that's, if you look at it that way, it's quite a good return. So the rent on these ones is about conservatively appraised at $725 per side. So while we're holding them, I actually saw some comparables renting for close to $800. So I've scaled that right back to be quite conservative. So $725 a side, which is a yield of about 4.8%. Typically, when we're looking at Brisbane, we can expect about a 5 to 5.2% yield. Once we start looking at the more executive rentals, which this would fall in the category of, we might see some slight scaling back in terms of that yield amount. But first year depreciation, we're getting quite a lot of depreciation. Again, quite a conservative calculation there, but we're looking at about 14,000, give or take, per side. So that's first year, that's full depreciation. So obviously that helps out with the cash flow. So this particular development, once all said and done, will actually be positive cash flow. And this particular number was based on our investor borrowing everything. So using existing equity, existing loan funds in their existing portfolio, borrowing against the, as I mentioned, the site purchase price and construction contracts. So effectively gearing everything. So they're not putting any cash at all. And I've looked at an interest-only loan repayment type, 4.5% interest rate and a 37% marginal rate of tax. So if you're getting a better interest rate and you're on a higher marginal rate of tax, obviously the holding cost would be higher. So effectively, you're able to leverage into an investment that's, I understand it's a considerable amount of money, 1.5, and I'll kind of cover off on some other examples a little bit more cheaper. But effectively, you're able to create some on-paper profit of over $200,000, and it hasn't cost you anything in terms of cash flow. So it's not a bad result. And most importantly, you're smack bang in a really good growth area. So that's obviously the fundamental reason why we're doing this. Just as a comparison in terms of purchase costs, just how it would reflect against an established property purchase. And we're not saying one's better than the other. We obviously, as buyers agents, do predominantly established property purchases. So if we spend the same amount of money on an established property or a number of them within Brisbane's or Queensland, I should say, stamp duty is actually $75,000. So again, you're going to have holding costs throughout construction. So it's not necessarily a black and white cut and dry comparison, but it does give you an idea of, okay, what is the stamp duty saving? So just a bit of perspective there. You can see what we're saving if we're to buy established versus buy something and redevelop. So that's, I guess, the numbers. So in terms of the due diligence that we do as buyers agents, most importantly, and I touched on this earlier, the site needs to tick all of the usual property, location, and growth driver boxes. Okay, so although development can create some pretty good growth for us or on-paper equity gains for us, as per the previous slide, in my mind, it's not a replacement. It's to supercharge what you're already doing. So very much, I remember talking to a couple of investors over the years, and they've said to me, and I talked about various returns on development. I said, look, it's readily achievable. We can look at something in the early teens within 12 months. And they've said, particularly in the last kind of 3 or 4 years, I heard it a lot with investors that have said to me, well, I got that myself just buying an established property in Sydney or Melbourne, and I've seen that growth. And my answer to that is always yes, but we want that as well. So we want our cake and eat it too. We want that profit via the development, but we're also buying in an area that still, definitely ticks all those boxes from a capital growth standpoint. I can't stress that enough. So we very much still need to do all our usual due diligence in terms of area, in terms of location. So in some cases, with these the previous 2 examples that we looked at, obviously we're demolishing, so we're starting from scratch. So we're assessing where the location of a dirt patch is, but it's still very important that we're looking at proximity to amenities and so on. So we still need to make sure that we've got all our boxes ticked there. The other thing is that we need to look at, for assessing a development site, we need to look at a confirmation of the lot size and boundaries. And quite often, you might think that's a bit of a no-brainer because you jump on a price finder or something that tells you how big it is. Quite often, in my experience, these tools are wrong. The Wavell Heights one, for example, gave us some erroneous information through Price Finder, and I had to do a title search to actually confirm how big it was. And this is important because it was going to be make or break as to whether we could subdivide and develop. And it was such the title was so old that it was actually in the archaic measurement of links and purchase. So we had to do the conversion there into square meters. But there was 3 sources that were all providing conflicting information. And again, the whole project swung on whether, how big it was in terms of boundaries and size per square meter. So that's really important. We also obviously, in some of this, look, that some of it's preliminary due diligence we're going to do up front before we even start putting in offers and things like that. And other due diligence is going to come out during the wash, whether we're doing it during our due diligence condition. So if we've purchased subject to a due diligence clause and we're doing our due diligence work there and we're using a combination of professionals and our solicitor. But some of the things we need to look at, any title restrictions, whether there's any covenants or heritage overlays on the site, but also if there's any easements. And we do obviously a lot of this as buyers agents on established properties anyway. So it's not all development specific. but it's, it's important due diligence nonetheless. And this, I guess the next part is, it's a little bit of an interesting one. If you're doing this as a private developer, it can be a little bit harder because as a buyer's agent, we've obviously got a lot of relationships with professionals that we've worked with over the years. So we're able to ask them to do, I guess, love jobs, so to do things for us in terms of for free, with the assumption that I'll get the work down the track. And it's a bit of chicken and egg. So when we're looking at sites, obviously we want to talk to some of these professionals and get them to give us feedback for free on the sites and tell us whether it's going to stack up, and kind of, I guess, cheekily try and get information, as I mentioned. And it can be a little bit harder to get that from the general public and know who to work with, and try and get that information if you don't have those relationships. But it's still, you're going to need these professionals at some point. So a town planner can help you, give you advice on what the cost is of subdividing, so your costs with council to put the DA through, so your development application, and give you advice as well, a bit of feedback on the site itself, and the development potential. You're also going to need a civil engineer. Now, a town planner is going to engage a civil engineer on your behalf, but it's also good, I think, when you're doing your preliminary due diligence and number crunching, to talk to a civil engineer who can give you advice on water, stormwater and sewer infrastructure. So they've got access to some subscription sites such as Dial Before You Dig and things like that you can also access as a private individual. But again, this is really important information that you want to glean from, as part of your due diligence on the site itself. And again, a builder. So you're not necessarily engaging a builder straight away, but it can be very helpful if you can get a builder to look at your site and give you advice on anything that might be hairy or curly about the site that you need to keep in mind. So whether it's the slope of the block and what would retaining an earthworks cost. Some of these also overlap. So with a civil engineer, they can give you advice and draw up a scope of works for water and sewer and stormwater infrastructure. But in some cases, such as stormwater, a builder might actually integrate that into the construction price there, which could be a little bit more cost effective. So things like that, working with those professionals. The other one is getting a demolition expert to give you some advice as well. So obviously that's quite important if our intention is to demolish a site and clear the site. And on that note, I mean, quite often, the example we looked at in Wavell Heights, we had a couple of pretty minor trees on there. They weren't that big, a few metres high, but they'll be demolished as part of the demo work, so we don't need a tree lopper. But if you've got trees that are on the fence line and things like that, you might also need a tree lopper, because your demo guys will go in there with a bulldozer, and if they start taking out trees, they could take out half the fence and next door if there's trees on the line there. But on that note of trees, you also want to do a vegetation check with council just to see whether there's any protected trees on site. So quite often, I mean, Brisbane City Council is great for this. You can ring them up, you can they'll give you a reference number. You take down the name of the individual you spoke to, and you've got basically a record of, whether or not confirmation, whether there's any protected trees on site. That's not bulletproof, mind you, but at least at this stage, before you've lodged your DA, you know that there's no trees that are going to make or break the deal at this stage. And then you do your usual flood and bushfire mapping as well. And again, we do this as standard BA purchases for anything anyway, but it's obviously just important preliminary due diligence. And a rental appraisal from a property manager. So if we're looking at developing to hold, we want to know what the property is obviously going to rent for. You saw before, I used an example there that we had a rental appraisal done at $725. That was scaled back a little bit, but we look at conservative estimates there. But that's obviously going to give us an insight into what the property is going to rent for. The completed development, I should say, is going to rent for. And it's also at that point can be really useful to talk to property managers, local property managers, about what they're seeing with the rental market. So what are some of the things that we need to keep in mind if we're building? And again, I really do stress the point that we're building from a resale perspective to appeal to owner-occupiers. We're not necessarily building from a rental standpoint, but in saying that, if our plan is to rent these out for the medium to long term, it's going to be pretty miserable to hold these properties if we can't find tenants and we can't get the maximum rent. So we really do want to, I guess, make sure we've got both bases covered in terms of appealing to tenants, but most importantly, appealing to the resale market. And on that note, we need to do a valuation. Obviously, to me, as a buyer's agent, again, whether it's a development or established property, I always say this is probably the number one skill to have, and that goes through to any real estate professional. And I can't stress that enough. I mean, to remove the mystery and be able to put your finger on an amount, actually quantify what a property is worth, to me, that's absolutely critical. And it's probably also, I mean, the number one skill, if you're an investor out there just doing it for yourself, to me, that's the number one skill to hone, to spend a lot of time. And it's also obviously the number one thing that people get wrong. But again, we want resale, we want evaluation on the initial site purchase to make sure we're paying a good price, but also how does it stack up and what's it going to make for us at the end. So the resale on completion, and at that point we can also talk to some local agents as well and get some feedback there. So, and most, as I mentioned before, we went through the numbers, feasibility study. So we've got to make sure that there's some profit in the whole development. Okay, so one of my friends, he always says, just because it can be done doesn't mean it should be done. So, and this, it might look good on paper, but we need to put all of these things together and make sure that there is actually going to be a market for the end product. But most importantly, it is actually going to make us money. And once all risks and contingencies and all those ifs and buts are put in there, it's actually a profitable venture. So that's, I guess, that's not everything. What we do is just a bit of insight. When we look at an established property purchase, there's about 40 odd questions that we go through with an established dwelling. So obviously we're pulling those out because if we're doing a development where we're demolishing, then a lot of those are not relevant in relation to the property itself. But in terms of location and all of those and relating to development, that's in a nutshell, that's a high level, they're the main ones. So as a bit of an insight into us doing the valuation, which I mentioned is very, very important, this is the process we go through. And again, this is the tip of the iceberg. I didn't just do evaluation on these 4, but this is, I guess, the 4 that I looked at which were most comparable. So out of the 3,000 odd lots within Wavell Heights, about 10% of those are roughly big enough to be subdivided, and about 10% of those are actually able to be subdivided in terms of boundary size and in terms of just being able to be subdivided and split. So there's not a huge amount to go by, and there's not a huge amount that have sold. So it is doing valuations on sites can be very, very difficult because it's not always comparable. It's not like you're doing a comparable on a 4-bedroom house that 50 of them have sold in the last 12 months, and you can pick and choose and really drill down and find one that exactly matches. Because particularly in areas like Wavell Heights, where the lots are very tightly held, doing comparables is quite difficult. So there's some compromises in there in relation to some. You can see, I've made some comments about location and so on, but basically I'm looking at what is the raw land worth. So the one at the top sold earlier in the year for just under 1.3 million. And that was subdividable into 3 lots, and that's actually a pretty slopey block, so that would cost quite a lot to cut and fill to get that and retain to get those to be ready for construction. But that was kind of my benchmark in terms of valuation. In terms of the completed project, I put in there 885, which is quite conservative, which I'll show you why. But this particular one, you can see these are all blocks. All the examples here are blocks that have been split over the last 10 years. So I've got 2 pages there, but they're all blocks that have been split. The first one at 307, in case you're wondering how they got down to under 400, there is a provision within Brisbane City Council to do blocks around 600 square metres. You can cut them into blocks 300 square metres in size, provided they meet certain requirements about being a certain proximity to major transport hubs. To me, I don't find those as appealing. Obviously, you're really casting a net that much smaller trying to look for them in the first place. But from a resale perspective, your blocks are going to be very, very small. So owner occupiers, you're not going to have much yard space left over. So I'm not saying that that's a deal breaker. I'm just saying my preference is to find something 400 square metre plus. But there are examples there of comparables, what we're going to be looking at with the completed development. Obviously, they're in different parts of the suburb to what we bought, and that's obviously going to affect the end valuation. But there you can see you can see, I guess, get an idea of what things are selling for in terms of the local area. I would say 7 Power Street, that was second from the top. That was one of the comparables that I looked at as being pretty close to what we're going to build. I like to think we're going to put a nicer facade than that one. I'm not entirely convinced of that one, but we'll probably put in 5-bed as well. So it'll be slightly, larger build. But again, that's a 2000 built this year and sold for 885 on the open market. So things are transacting. So we're not just, this is really important. We're not just looking at, okay, best case scenario on paper, how does it work? We're looking at drilling right down and knowing what things are selling for, and it's really, really important. So again, coming back to my comment about unicorns, they're definitely not a unicorn. We're not creating something that's a white elephant on the market. We're creating something that people really want, and people are lining up to buy as you can see with the figures there. So I'm sure there's people out there that are sitting there saying, that's all very well, Alex, it sounds exciting, but I don't have $1.5 million. And that's me too, to be honest. But so one of the, I guess, alternatives that we can look at is to buy something with the idea of developing down the track or selling later. So all those, the due diligence that we looked at and went through in relation to on the development potential on the site itself, we can apply that to something and not necessarily have to follow through with that straight away. So one of the areas that I really like at the moment, and I'm sure, Terry, you like it as well, is Moreton Bay. You got any thoughts on Moreton Bay, Terry?
You're right, Alex. I do like it. I like it a lot. I think it's the most active part of the Brisbane metropolitan area in terms of property markets at the moment. It offers a lot in terms of affordability, proximity to major jobs nodes. It's got really good infrastructure. There's new things coming up in that market, such as a new university campus, recent extension of rail links to the Redcliffe Peninsula, and a whole lot of other things. But also find that when like mentoring clients of ours are looking for opportunities where you can do this kind of thing, where you can perhaps subdivide or perhaps build townhouses or whatever. It's an area that does have those sorts of opportunities. So it ticks a lot of boxes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Harry. So I couldn't agree more. And that's, I guess, why we've chosen it. So I think it's a really good option for someone that's looking at doing a more affordable development, but maybe not following through with it straight away. And this comes off the back of one of the comments I made earlier about, the best stories that I've heard with development are someone that's owned the site for a long time and capitalised on the development potential down the track. And Moreton Bay, they're also very progressive. So it's not Brisbane City Council; they're a separate council in their own right, and they're very progressive from a development standpoint. So very, very open-minded with what you can do. In this particular one, so 23 kilometres north of Brisbane CBD. Again, pretty. Not a fantastic build on it, but again, this is what we're after, but a 3-bed, 1-bath, 3-carport home. But most importantly, on a big block, 1,026 square metre block. Purchased for $490, so we're paying a lot for land size. We're not getting that 5% rental yield that we talked about, which you traditionally get in Moreton Bay if you're looking at a smaller land, so just a single block. But again, we're paying a little bit more because we're getting extra land. And this ties in with, obviously everyone's familiar, I'm sure, with the idea that you get rent return on the dwelling itself, not on the land. So the dwelling itself, again, is not fantastic, but again, we want to demolish, but that's the rent return as is. So, but if you look at it, that yield is probably comparable to what you'd pay on the outskirts of Melbourne anyway right now. Obviously, you wouldn't get the depreciation because there isn't a depreciation on the build, this one in particular. But the yields, it's not typical of Brisbane, but it's not that unsavoury given the development potential. But excuse me, most importantly, it falls under the suburban neighbourhood precinct zoning in Moreton Bay, which means you can have 15 dwellings per hectare, which means that this actual site is suitable for townhouse developments. So this can fit 8 townhouses on it. So these plans are specific to this. But if you look through the fee, so we did a feasibility study on this one. Purchase price $490, purchase cost. So we've got our stamp duty, our legal fees, and cheekily I put in buyer's agent's fees, why not? And we've got our development costs. So we've got our town planner, costs for development application lodgement. We've got plan ceilings for titling at the end. We've got our council contribution. So each time we create a second lot, we have to pay council for the privilege. In this case, it's around $18,000. We've got a civil works design and permit. So we've got things like, so for our water and sewer infrastructure, we've got demolition. So to get rid of the old cow shed, that's Kate's favourite expression on the site. Retaining and earthwork, so to get the site level. The other additional connections, survey plans, interest during construction, so to pay for our progress payments for our construction and for our site once there's no more income coming in through land, through the rent, and also contingencies. So they're all the development costs. So you see there's quite some considerable. And our construction to build the 8 townhouses, 1.296. So you might be looking at this and saying, hey, you said, you know, at a cheaper alternative, but what I'm looking at here is something that's again a little bit more affordable, but to develop and sell later. So total project cost 2.3, value 2.88. So we're assuming 360,000 per unit. Gross profit is 535 on this one. So again, we haven't considered their GST implications. If we're developing with the intention to sell, we've got GST implications because we're effectively becomes a commercial venture, and we've got capital gains tax obviously to sell within 12 months, and we've got selling agent fees to sell these. So the profit margin for this one is 23%, which quite frankly doesn't quite stack up right now for a developer. And again, this would be really, you would only be able to achieve this if you were a commercial, if you had commercial lending. So this would really be a professional developer turning this into, making this work. Unless you're able to form a syndicate or something like that with a group of your fellow investors. But the profit margin is probably doesn't quite work just yet, okay? So the reason I raise this is as an example of buying and just knowing that it ticks all the boxes from a development standpoint, with the exception of profit margin. It's still, there's money in there, but it's not quite meaty enough to justify doing the development straight away. So you could look at holding on to that until such time. I mean, Terry touched on it. There's a new university going in Petrie that's obviously going to have a dramatic effect on the area. And if you're building something like townhouses, then perhaps that's suitable for student accommodation or locals that are going to be visiting the university there. So it's, to me, that's could be a lot more appealing once the market picks up and can bear, I guess, the cost. So if you look at townhouse developments going up to be, the townhouse is selling for 380 or 400. Obviously, the profit metrics are going to work much more favourably at that point, and then you can find, you can start to think about on selling the site. So that's an example of, I guess, two examples there to look at the market where it currently lies. Obviously, ideally, I'm not saying we can't develop with the intention of selling straight away, but given where the market is right now, in terms of, I guess where all the markets are, I should say, Australia's not one big property market, but where the markets are, and I guess without trying to be too buoyant on certain areas, if we look at, okay, how do we hedge our bets and say, finding opportunities that I guess are going to turbocharge our capital growth, we can look at opportunities like this. So I guess some of the things to keep in mind with developing. So I get asked a lot about particular areas all the time. I get asked about, do developments work here? Do developments work there? And a lot of time the questions I get asked are really at the fringe areas or the cheaper areas, entry level. And because, a lot of the development costs, construction, your subdivision costs, so your council contributions, are mostly, they're fixed. They're not geographically dependent. So in other words, whether you're building a house in Logan or you're building a house in Wavell Heights, it's, in Brisbane, for example, it's still going to be the same cost, give or take. It might be slightly cheaper here and there, but for the most part, it's pretty much the same. So your underlying land value is that much cheaper. So the development site's going to be cheaper to find. But in terms of the actual resale, that's not there either. So the market can't bear resale metrics there. So it's not going to work. Shared ownership structures, I get asked this a lot. Me and my friends want to pull funds together. We want to form a syndicate, a trust, or a partnership. And I guess my comments around that is, look, it can work. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but I guess there's some things to consider relating to shared liability. So, if you're actually borrowing against the development itself, so if you're leveraging against the cost of construction and the site purchase, then as a co-borrower, you're going to be liable for other people's debts as well. So that's going to potentially significantly erode your borrowing capacity for things elsewhere. So you're getting effectively, you're 100% liable for the debt on the entire project, but you're only getting a portion of the profit. So that's just something to keep in mind. And also shared ownership structures such as these, typically when you're doing a syndicate or a trust or a partnership, you don't actually own one dwelling. So if you're doing a townhouse development of, say, 4 townhouses and the 4 of you are getting together, you each own a quarter of each townhouse. So you don't own, each doesn't own a single lot. So these kind of structures are really more appropriate for develop to sell strategies. And I get asked about them a lot, so that's why I thought I'd mention those. And also we touched on these as well. So if you're looking to develop to sell, consider the capital gains tax and GST implications and the selling agent fees. Obviously, they're going to significantly erode your profit margins. And that's why, again, I looked at develop to sell. And of course, goes without saying, but account for loan repayments during construction. A lot of people kind of overlook this, but holding a development and funding construction without any rent coming in, although it's tax deductible with your intent to rent them out, it still obviously makes the proposition that much more costly from a cash flow standpoint. Speed of construction can be really critical there. So to make sure that you can get to site ASAP with the development, and obviously engage a builder that's ready to go and can turn around developments as quickly as they say they can. So some of the tips, I've got to breeze through these pretty quickly because, of course, I'm running out of time, as I said I would. My comments about this, if you're not a professional developer, if you're just starting out, I would always advocate developing with the intent to resell to and cater to the owner-occupier market, not the investor market. That's really, really important. And as a general rule of thumb, I mentioned this earlier, but the idea is that we want the biggest build that we can possibly get away with squeezing onto the site itself. So we want to get the biggest structure we can on that the parcel of land the lot will bear, and also the resale market as well. So that's the rule of thumb. And quite often when we're looking at, again, catering to the tenant market, it may not necessarily be, I guess that the two might not be mutually inclusive. In other words, we might be building something that doesn't necessarily suit ideally the tenant demographic there, but again, we need to be appealing to the resale market as a priority. So, as with any opportunity, really, and this is obviously what, in part why people engage buyers agents such as myself and us at Adviseable, is to find the opportunities that are not on the open market. But with development sites, the best ones all sell off market. It's just a fact of life. I mean, they don't come along very often, and you've got to be really ready to jump on them. And you've got to work. My experience is working with selling agents that actually focus on securing potential development sites. And I put in the word potential there because selling agents' jobs are to sell. They can't always, obviously they don't necessarily know all the nuts and bolts relating to whether a site has the potential to be redeveloped. So you'll see that all the time in listings, inverted commas, subject to council approval, SDCA. So you see that all the time, and that's just their little disclaimer. And again, when you're looking at a site, we need to know, and it's going to be different in every area, but we need to know the ideal boundary configuration for a subdivision. So the examples that I gave, Wavell Heights one and the other one in Sandgate, we're looking at 20 metre frontage, 40 metre deep. So we want to turn it into 10 by 40 blocks, long and narrow, that we can build 2 high sets on for this example. So a lot of the time, I get asked, I've got a block, I bought a block ages ago, just by a sheer chance, it's, about 100 square meters, can we subdivide? And quite often the answer is no, because of a whole bunch of reasons. It could be trees on footpath, it could be, it could be a whole bunch of different reasons based on, go back to the due diligence we talked about. And the other thing is, and on that note, make sure when we do our due diligence, do a due diligence on the footpath and streetscape adjoining the block. So it could be, again, trees on, it could be a curbing, it could be a drop off the slopes away from the nature strip onto the front of the block, and this could affect setback. So setback is, I guess, how close to your boundary you can build. And this is really important because it can eat up into your developable space. So if this block is sloping, particularly at the front where you want a driveway, obviously that can push back where you can build, and that can leave you with a smaller yard and things like that. So it's knowing all of those really important little things along the way that can really make or break a development throughout the process. And again, like anything with property investment, make sure that you assemble your team of professionals ahead of time so you can jump on any opportunities as soon as they come up. So the good ones will sell very, very fast. So, it's not uncommon for me to have a site or even any property opportunity drop into my lap. I say that tongue in cheek. Obviously, there's been a lot of groundwork to get them, but we get them. They appear, that afternoon, and by the next day, we've got a contract on them. And that obviously applies even more so to development opportunities where they're scarcer. And one of the kind of tips I'd throw in there would be to negotiate a special condition to be inserted in the purchase contract so that we can lodge the DA prior to settlement, or alternatively negotiate a longer settlement. So lodging the DA, which is obviously a bit of a dead time because we can't do anything, we can't start on site until we've got that approved, but obviously once the settlement of the site occurs, we're going to be having to start paying for our loan on that. So we want the two to be as close together as we possibly can. So that's just a little tip there. Quickly, just choosing a builder. My preferences around that would be looking for smaller family-sized builders. Quite often, we look at the builders' websites and marketing material and stuff like that, and they can be not that amazing. And I always say, look, I would be hesitant to judge a builder based on their marketing material. We want to know how good they are, and we want to look at, I guess, their history as well. One of my favourite builders in Brisbane, they've been family-owned business. They've been working in the area for 40 years, father and son team. They're not getting too big. They do a really great quality of finish, and they're very punctual, and they're very reliable. So, it's smaller business like that and we've got a great relationship, and they're the types that you can approach ahead of time, like I was saying, get to visit the site and provide feedback on suitability for development. And also I just encourage to shop around. So just to, compare apples with apples, because you'd be amazed at what's included, what's not included. And on that note, we want fixed price contracts. We want builders that are going to provide customized designs. Obviously, builders are going to reuse certain designs and things like that, but we want each development to be customised, and we want each drawing to be customised, not just cookie cutter. So they're kind of some of the comments there. Very quickly, some huge generalisations in terms of areas, and looking at this not just from development, but also buying established properties. Brisbane City Council, so this is pretty much my favourite area at the moment for developing, so within the 10k radius of the CBD, and Moreton Bay, which we've already touched on. Sydney, there are some certain areas that we look at in developing in Sydney. Blacktown Council being a favourite, Sutherland Shire, Ringa Shire, a few other areas, but quite frankly, your construction costs are so high, and the land purchase is so high, and also your resale is, the market's going sideways. Again, gross generalisation. So my comment would be to, based on what I'm seeing, I'll be looking at doing some purchases where you can reno and hold. So not, again, trying to avoid that resale market right now. So I really do like renovations, love renovations. So anything that we can do value add to property I really like, whether it is as big a scale as development or renovations, and bailout. And look, when I say bailout, I'm saying there's a lot of investors out there at the moment that are panicking. They're doing silly things, particularly in the investor space, because there's fewer investors out there, so there's less competition. So there's some really good buys to be had It sounds counterintuitive, but again, that's what we like. But in Sydney at the moment, we're seeing some really good opportunities. So I wouldn't necessarily be jumping on development right now. Melbourne, we've been buying a lot in Melbourne, but quite frankly, I'd be looking at kind of regional Vic myself. And Adelaide and Perth, I'd be looking at established. And Perth is not going to be for everyone, I'm sure. Terry's touched on this in his reports and so on, but at the same time, it's a fantastic opportunity. It really is a buyer's market. So there's some great buys to be had there. But again, if you want more info on areas, I very much encourage you to look at my colleague Kate Hill's presentation that she did a month or so ago. So I think I've used up all our time, but if we have any time, Terry, for any questions?
Yeah, Alex, certainly. We do have a little bit of time. If people would like to type their questions into the chat box or the Q&A panel, and I'll put those to Alex. We have had some come through already, Alex. One was just a general question of, is there any reason why you focus so much on Brisbane? Is that an area of particular opportunity at the moment, do you think?
There's a variety of reasons. I mean, I just like it from an affordability standpoint. So my goal when I was setting up, the product offering that we have at Adviseable was I spent a lot of time, and I worked on a variety of different capacities throughout the real estate industry, but I really wanted to bring on board or offer development opportunities that were going to genuinely make people money, but were as affordable as possible. And that led me to Brisbane because I feel like the market hasn't boomed in terms of, it's had some pretty good solid growth in certain areas. You wouldn't believe it if you're listening to the general media, but there's been some pockets that have had some significant growth over the last few years, but it's still very affordable. So land prices haven't gone astronomical. I live in the inner west of Sydney myself, and just watching prices go through the roof, it's amazing. Also in Melbourne, I mean, prices are so expensive. There's still plenty of opportunities in both of those markets. I'm not saying there's opportunities everywhere, but we just like Brisbane from an affordability standpoint. So that's why I kind of targeted that. What's the most affordable area that we can target, where construction is also relatively cheap, but most importantly, that resale market is still strong. So we've got a genuine resale market to own occupiers. In this case, based on the examples, it's going to be our second and third home buyers, but that's the kind of thing that we want to tick all those boxes. So again, I was limited; I couldn't show all the examples, but that's why we like Brisbane.
Alex, a question about you made reference to the stamp duty savings, where you effectively are buying land and developing, so you're not paying a stamp duty on the build. Is it not the case that at least part of the stamp duty savings are negated by the interest bill, the sort of the holding time?
Yeah, and I mentioned that. So look, it's a bit of a give and take. So your holding costs with your progress payments on your construction and things like that are going to eat into the stamp duty savings. So I'm not saying I'm definitely not saying that's a reason why you'd buy new, but I'm just pointing out that kind of 6 one way, half a dozen the other. I mean, you'll still come out ahead based on most calculations that I've done. You'll still come out ahead, and the interest is tax deductible. So your progress payments, your interest repayments, if you're going to rent it out at the end, if your intent is to create rental properties, your interest repayments during construction, even though there's no rental income coming in, is still tax deductible. So you still come out ahead. But again, you're right. Yep, you've definitely got to factor that in, and that's why I mentioned that in the one of the other slides as well, with things to watch out for. Make sure you get into that.
A question about a reference you made quite early in the presentation, where you talked about the ability to manufacture yield, and the question is, can you explain what you mean by that? Yeah,
I guess manufacturing yield, what I'm looking at is, you think about the rent return that you get is mostly based on, in a roundabout way, it's based on the value of the property itself. So if you're creating equity, you're turning something that cost you 1.5 into something that's worth 1.7 odd at the end, you're getting a rental yield of 1.7, to the value to coincide with a 1.7 value, but your loan is only 1.5 or funding a 1.5 purchase, if that makes sense. So you're getting a better yield than you would than if you bought outright and established. So I guess that's what I look at when I say manufacturing yield. So you're not just manufacturing equity, you're also manufacturing a bit of rent return there as well.
Okay. There was also a question, there was a reference you made, Alex, to you sort of limited to a maximum of 2 or 3 lots. Is that in terms of what council allows, or is it to do with the finance you can get?
That's to do with to do with the latter. So that's really the banks. So with funding for development, I mean, it's obviously funding right now is more important than ever. So I always say this. I mean, I always say this. Your borrowing capacity at the moment, I mean, it's an asset in itself right now. It's a commodity in itself. So you really need to use it wisely. But I mean, I was a mortgage broker many years ago, so having kind of been through that, the best of times, obviously it's very different now. I could imagine doing it now, but it's one of the most limiting things, quite frankly, that we face right now. We've got, you know, dozens and dozens, scores of investors that we're working with that are wanting to buy more properties, but just can't access the funding to do it. So it's quite interesting. But at the same time, what I mentioned there with the limitations around dwellings is that most banks will look at a maximum subdivision of 3 dwellings, so turning 1 lot into 3. That's the most they'll fund under standard residential lending. So once you go beyond that, some banks are limited to only 2, and once you go beyond that, that's when it falls under commercial lending. And again, that might be fine. You might be able to look at commercial lending. That obviously opens up a total new avenue in terms of the opportunities that you can look at buying. But again, I'm looking at as a starting point with this presentation, it was okay. Let's find development sites that are accessible for us mere mortals that are looking at, you know, getting standard residential lending through our equity through our existing portfolio or cash deposits, and not having, I guess, a track record and being able to prove that we've done this before if we haven't had any experience.
I think, yeah, you mentioned one of your case studies. You had to put it in your figures to show representative figures how the numbers work. A 4.5% interest rate, and that's realistic as long as you fit within those sort of caps that the banks like.
Yeah, look, I mean, talk with your broker, but I mean, again, this should fit under standard resi lending. So it's no different than if you were to buy a house and land package, or if you were to do some construction yourself, buy an established property. Funding the construction and a development like this is not going to be any different than a standard investment property purchase. Obviously, some of the numbers we're talking about are slightly higher. But again, I'm just painting a brutally honest picture. I don't want to paint a picture of, you know, again, the unicorns, things that don't exist or are too good to be true. We're saying, okay, this is readily achievable. This is what we can find. And there's an established market out there, blocks and sites like this exist. And these can be achieved by standard residential lending. So your interest rates shouldn't be affected you know, any differently than if we're buying an established investment property purchase.
We should probably wrap it up shortly, Alex, but just one more question perhaps. You mentioned towards the end of your presentation the importance of configuring something to sell to owner-occupiers, not investors, and what was the reasoning behind that strategy idea?
Yeah, look, I think, I mean, it kind of ties in with my other rule of thumb that I mentioned, that we want to get the biggest dwelling we can on this, that the block of land will bear. So, you know, and that normally equates to, in this example, if we're limited based on lending to do a subdivision into 2 lots or maybe 3, we're not going to be doing townhouses. That's commercial. We're doing standard residential. We're going to be doing big homes. Okay, so I mean, it's possible that an investor might want to buy one of these big homes if they're a bit more astute and they know that they want to hold on to it and sell it to an owner-occupier down the track. But I mean, it's kind of the same thing where we're looking at appealing to owner-occupiers. I mean, to me, generally speaking, whether it's established property purchase or not, I always say we want to target owner-occupiers. They're the ones that are going to make you money when you come to sell, and that is because they're willing to pay a premium. Again, some investors out there might pay too much for certain things, but again, we want to buy in a market that's very active with owner-occupiers. We won't want to be creating something that we're selling to interstate investors. We want to be selling something where there's a true market in there of people that are thinking emotionally and just like something for what it represents, not necessarily yield and things like that. So again, this is why we're saying with those examples in Wavell Heights, we'll build them build them to suit the local resale market, but we'll leave a bit of space to put in a pool and things like that down the track so we can really maximise our capacity to sell to owner-occupiers come resale.
Okay, Alex, well, thank you for those responses and for your presentation. I think we've gone a little bit over the hour, so we should probably wrap it up now. And by its very nature, it's a subject that has complexities, and there's a lot more for people to know. And I would encourage people whose appetite has been perhaps a little bit whetted or inspired by Alex's presentation to get in touch with Alex or his colleague Kate Hill via the contact details on the screen if you've got further questions, or if you're interested in perhaps getting Adviseable to find opportunities for you. Please get in touch with them. Alex, thank you for a very informative presentation today. It's certainly opened my eyes to some of the possibilities in terms of how you can accelerate the equity creation or wealth creation process by undertaking something a little bit more creative or exciting than a passive investment, and the potential is enormous. Any final comments from you, Alex, before we wrap it up?
Firstly, say thanks to you, Terry, and thanks very much to everyone that's still sticking around. And look, any questions at all, we don't do the hard sell at Adviseable. We're definitely happy to help you, but any questions at all, you want a bit of advice, if you're midway through a development, you're looking at doing a development, feel free to email me, give me a buzz. I'm happy to help out.
Okay, Alex, thank you again, and thank you everyone for participating. This is Terry Ryder from Hotspotting signing off. Let's do it again soon, Alex. Always find the webinars I do with yourself and Kate at Adviseable particularly informative and interesting, and certainly gets me inspired to go out and do things.